The morning coffee turned to ash in Elena's mouth as the news anchor's voice filled their suburban kitchen. She watched her husband David pause mid-bite of his toast, his eyes fixed on the television screen, where a familiar face stared back at them from behind bulletproof glass. Vincent the Wolf Torrino, the most feared crime boss on the East Coast, sat stoically as federal prosecutors outlined decades of racketeering, murder, and corruption. What made Elena's blood run cold wasn't the litany of charges, but the list of witnesses the prosecutor began reading aloud. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The prosecution will call Elena Vasquez, formerly known as Elena Torrino, sister to the defendant and key witness to multiple criminal enterprises spanning 15 years. David's fork clattered against his plate. His head turned slowly toward his wife of 8 years. Confusion etched across his features like a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Elena sat frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling with each word that followed. This was the moment she had spent nearly a decade dreading, the reckoning she thought would never come. Elena Martinez had perfected the art of invisibility. For 8 years, she had been the devoted wife who brought homemade lasagna to neighborhood potlucks, volunteered at the local animal shelter, and maintained a pristine garden that was the envy of Maple Street. Her neighbors knew her as the quiet woman who worked as a freelance graphic designer, someone who preferred books to parties and whose biggest rebellion was occasionally staying up past 11 to finish a novel. They had no idea that the woman who baked award-winning chocolate chip cookies had once been the bookkeeper for one of the most ruthless criminal organizations in the country. The transition from Elena Torrino to Elena Martinez hadn't happened overnight. It had taken 3 years of federal protection, 2 plastic surgeries to soften her distinctive features, and countless hours of coaching to lose the Brooklyn accent that had marked her as Vincent's sister. She had traded her designer clothes for Target clearance items, her Manhattan penthouse for a modest 3-bedroom ranch house, and her previous life of luxury and constant danger for the peaceful predictability of suburban anonymity. Meeting David had been an accident, a genuine surprise in a life that had been carefully orchestrated by federal marshals. She had been at the local coffee shop working on a logo design for a small business client when he approached her table with an apologetic smile. His laptop had died, he explained, and he desperately needed to send an email to his real estate client. Could he possibly borrow her computer for just a few minutes? There had been something refreshingly normal about his request, something that spoke to the ordinary life she had been trying so hard to build. David Lawson was everything her previous world had taught her to dismiss. He was an honest man who paid his taxes on time, returned extra change when cashiers made mistakes, and whose biggest secret was that he still slept with a stuffed elephant his grandmother had given him when he was 7. He sold houses in their sleepy Connecticut town, coached Little League on weekends, and had never been inside a police station for anything more serious than renewing his driver's license. He was safe, predictable, and utterly unaware that the woman who would become his wife had spent her 20s laundering money through a network of shell companies and legitimate businesses. The courtship had been gentle, normal in ways that still surprised Elena. David brought her flowers from the grocery store rather than elaborate arrangements that cost more than most people's rent. He took her to chain restaurants and community theater productions, instead of exclusive establishments where violence lurked behind velvet ropes. Their dates consisted of hiking, picnics, and movie nights at home.
Trails, museum visits, and Sunday farmers markets. Activities so mundane and wholesome that Elena sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. It was a feeling she had grown to cherish. When David proposed, it was during a sunset walk around the local lake, with a ring he had saved for 6 months to buy. There were no armed bodyguards watching from nearby benches, no need to check the area for potential threats, no encrypted phone calls interrupting the moment, just a good man asking a woman he loved to share his life, completely unaware that she had been Elena Martinez for less time than they had been dating. She said yes because she loved him, but also because she desperately wanted to become the woman he believed her to be. Their wedding was small, intimate, held in the backyard of the house they had purchased together. David's family embraced her warmly, never questioning why her side of the aisle was sparsely populated. She had told them her parents were deceased and she was estranged from her remaining family, which was technically true if you considered witness protection a form of death and federal custody a type of estrangement. Her handler, Agent Sarah Chen, had attended as her cousin from California, one of only 3 people at the ceremony who knew the bride's real history. Marriage to David had been a revelation in normalcy. He left coffee cups in the sink and forgot to take out the trash. He sang off-key in the shower and fell asleep watching late-night television. He worried about ordinary things like mortgage payments and whether their lawnmower needed service. His biggest crisis was when their internet went out during a crucial client presentation, not when rival families threatened territorial disputes with automatic weapons. Elena found herself genuinely happy for the first time since childhood, before she had understood what her father's business really entailed. David's acceptance of her supposed orphan status had been complete and unquestioning. When she claimed to have no photographs from her childhood due to a house fire, he never pressed for details. When she deflected questions about her past relationships or college experiences, he respected her privacy. His trust was absolute, built on the assumption that everyone deserved to start fresh, that the past was less important than the future they were building together. It was a perspective that Elena found both heartwarming and terrifying, knowing how thoroughly she was deceiving the man she had come to love more than her own safety. The years had passed peacefully. Elena's graphic design business had grown through word-of-mouth referrals, mostly small, local companies that needed logos and marketing materials. She specialized in helping family businesses establish their brand identity, work that felt like penance for the years she had helped disguise criminal enterprises behind legitimate facades. David's real estate career had flourished as well, his genuine personality and ethical approach earning him a reputation as the most trusted agent in their area. They had talked about children, about growing old together, about all the ordinary dreams that Elena had never imagined she would be allowed to pursue. The illusion of safety had been so complete that Elena had begun to believe her own cover story. She introduced herself as Elena Martinez, without the slight hesitation that had marked her first years in witness protection. She genuinely enjoyed the community events and neighborhood barbecues that would have been impossible in her previous life. She had even started to forget some of the details of her former existence, the way people forget nightmares in the clear light of day. The federal marshals had done their job too well, creating a new identity so convincing that even she had been fooled into thinking it was permanent. But Vincent Torrino had always been a patient man, and prison had given him 8 years to plan his defense. Elena knew her brother well enough to understand that he would never go quietly to a life sentence. He had resources, connections, and a network of loyal associates who had avoided capture during the initial federal sweep. More importantly, he had information about government corruption that went to the highest levels, leverage that could be used to negotiate a better outcome. Elena had always known that her testimony had been crucial to his conviction, just as she knew that his appeal would inevitably draw her back into the spotlight she had worked so hard to escape. The morning of the news report, Elena had been planning a surprise party for David's 40th birthday. She had spent weeks coordinating with his friends and colleagues, booking the community center, and arranging for his favorite band from college to perform. The guest list included their neighbors, his baseball team, colleagues from his real estate office, and members of the historical society where he volunteered. It was going to be a celebration of the life they had built together, surrounded by people who knew them as the stable, loving couple who had become the unofficial welcome committee for new residents on Maple Street. Instead, she found herself staring at a television screen that displayed her former life in stark detail. The news report included photographs from her father's funeral 15 years earlier, images that clearly showed her standing beside Vincent as they laid Anthony Torrino to rest. Her face was younger,
harder, framed by the sleek black hair she had worn before federal marshals convinced her to become a blonde. She was wearing a designer dress that had cost more than David's monthly mortgage payment, surrounded by men whose names regularly appeared in FBI most wanted lists. The reporter was explaining Elena's role in the original prosecution, how her testimony had provided crucial insider information about the Torrino family's money laundering operations. They detailed her admission that she had managed financial records for 17 different criminal enterprises, helping to disguise drug profits as legitimate business income. The reporter mentioned that Elena Torrino had disappeared after the trial, presumably into witness protection, and that her current whereabouts had been unknown until federal prosecutors filed their witness list for Vincent's appeal. David had stopped chewing. His coffee cup remained halfway to his lips as he processed the information flooding their kitchen through the morning news. Elena could see the exact moment when recognition dawned, when he began to match the face on the screen with the woman sitting across from him. She watched 8 years of trust and love collide with the reality of who she had been before they met, before she had learned to find happiness in ordinary moments and simple pleasures. The silence stretched between them like a physical presence. Elena wanted to speak, to explain, to somehow bridge the chasm that had opened in their kitchen between one heartbeat and the next. But the words that came to mind belonged to her former life, the kind of calculated responses she had learned from watching her father and brother navigate dangerous conversations. Those skills felt wrong here, in this house, where honesty was supposed to be the foundation of everything they had built together. David finally set down his coffee cup with the careful precision of someone trying not to break something precious. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. Elena Torrino. He said the name like he was testing how it felt in his mouth, like he was trying to understand how those syllables had never appeared in 8 years of marriage. Vincent Torrino's sister? The way he said it wasn't accusatory exactly. It was more like confusion, the tone of someone trying to reconcile two completely different versions of reality. Elena recognized the look in his eyes because she had seen it in mirrors during her first month in witness protection. The expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of the world had just been shattered. She had hoped never to see that look directed at her by someone she loved. "David, I can explain," she began, but the words sounded hollow even to her.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Own ears. How could she explain 8 years of deception to a man whose entire relationship with her had been built on a foundation of lies? How could she make him understand that every moment of happiness they had shared had been real for her, even if her identity had been manufactured by federal agents? He held up a hand to stop her, his gesture gentle but firm. The woman they're talking about on the news, the one who testified against her own brother? That's you? It wasn't a question. The evidence was undeniable, spread across their television screen in photographs and court documents that painted a picture of Elena Torrino, the mob princess turned government witness who had helped destroy her own family's criminal empire. Elena nodded, the simple gesture feeling like the most honest thing she had done in years. Yes, that's who I used to be. David stood up from the breakfast table, his movements careful and deliberate. He walked to the window that overlooked their backyard, where Elena's prized vegetable garden was beginning to show signs of spring growth. She had planted those tomatoes and peppers with her own hands, had spent countless hours nurturing them from seeds into thriving plants. It was honest work, the kind of simple accomplishment that had helped her feel like Elena Martinez might be more than just a convenient fiction. "Used to be," he repeated, his voice carrying a note she had never heard before. It wasn't anger, exactly, but something deeper and more complicated. "Elena, we've been married for 8 years. We've shared everything, or at least I thought we had.
I know you don't like mushrooms on pizza. I know you have nightmares sometimes, but you never want to talk about them. I know you cry during insurance commercials and that you count the locks on the doors twice before bed every night." He turned back to face her, and Elena saw her own pain reflected in his expression. "But I don't know who you are. I don't know who I married. I don't know whose bed I've been sharing or whose dreams I've been planning to make come true." The truth of his words hit Elena harder than any physical blow. She had been so focused on becoming Elena Martinez that she had never considered how her transformation might feel to someone who loved her. David had fallen in love with a carefully constructed identity, had built his life around a woman who existed only because federal marshals had needed to hide Elena Torrino somewhere safe. Every anniversary they had celebrated, every dream they had shared, every moment of intimacy had been shadowed by secrets he had never imagined existed. "The nightmares," she said quietly, understanding finally dawning. "You always asked, but I could never tell you. They're memories, David. Things I saw, things I was part of before I met you. The counting locks, the way I check exits whenever we go somewhere new, the reason I've never wanted to travel internationally, it's all because of who I used to be." David's shoulders sagged as pieces of their shared history began to make sense in ways he had never considered. Elena could see him remembering moments that had seemed quirky or endearing, but now carried darker implications. Her reluctance to be photographed, her insistence on always paying in cash, the way she sometimes seemed to recognize people in crowds who never acknowledged her in return. Details that had been easy to overlook when you loved someone became suspicious when viewed through the lens of deception. "The scars," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible. "The one on your shoulder that you said was from falling off your bike as a kid. The mark on your arm that you claimed was from a childhood accident." Elena touched her shoulder unconsciously, remembering the night Vincent's lieutenant decided she was getting too curious about the family business. She was 19, young enough to think she could challenge her brother's authority, old enough to understand exactly what those scars represented. "Surgery," she admitted. "Plastic surgery to change my appearance. The marshals thought it
Necessary to keep me safe." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished fire. David sat back down at the breakfast table, his hands folded in front of him, with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control. Elena recognized the gesture because she had spent years learning to contain her own emotions, to present a calm facade even when everything inside was chaos. "Marshals," he said slowly. "As in federal marshals? As in witness protection?" "Yes." "For 8 years you've been in witness protection. For our entire relationship, our entire marriage, you've been hiding from your former life with the help of the federal government?" "Yes." David was quiet for a long time, his gaze fixed on the television screen, where reporters were now interviewing legal experts about the implications of Elena's expected testimony. The sound was muted, but Elena could see graphics showing organizational charts of the Torrino crime family, photographs of her father and uncle, timelines of criminal activity that spanned decades. It was her history laid bare, the world she had been born into and had spent years trying to escape. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" David asked finally. "In 10 years, 20 years, 50 years of marriage? Was there ever going to be a moment when you thought I deserved to know who I was actually married to?" The question cut deeper than Elena had expected. She had convinced herself that her silence was protection, that keeping David ignorant of her past was a gift rather than a betrayal. She had told herself that Elena Martinez was real because the emotions were real, that love could transform lies into truth through sheer force of feeling. But faced with his pain, she could see how selfish her reasoning had been. "I wanted to," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "So many times I wanted to tell you everything, but I was afraid you would leave, afraid you would see me differently, and I was afraid for your safety. The less you knew, the safer you were." "Safer from what?" Elena gestured toward the television screen. "From that. From Vincent's associates who might use you to get to me, from rival families who might see you as leverage, from federal agents who might decide you knew too much to be left alone." As if summoned by her words, Elena's phone began to ring. The caller ID showed only numbers, but Elena recognized the pattern. It was Agent Chen.
the handler who had managed her transition into witness protection and had maintained periodic contact throughout her marriage. The call Elena had been dreading for 8 years, the one that would signal the end of her carefully constructed normal life. "I have to answer this," she told David, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the phone. "Elena, it's Sarah. I assume you've seen the news." Agent Chen's voice was professional but not unkind. "We need to discuss your options. Vincent's legal team has made it clear they intend to call you as a witness, which means your current identity is compromised." "Options?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew what Agent Chen was going to tell her. "We can relocate you again. New identity, new location, new life. The paperwork is already in motion if you decide that's the route you want to take." Elena looked at David, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. 8 years of marriage, and she was no longer certain she could interpret his emotions. "What about my husband?" There was a pause before Agent Chen responded. "That's complicated. He was never supposed to be part of this situation. Technically, your marriage to him violated the terms of your witness protection agreement." "You knew about David," Elena said, her voice rising slightly. "You attended our wedding. You knew because it was my job to know, but headquarters was never officially informed because we all understood that you deserved some chance at happiness. Now that Vincent's case is back in court, everyone is paying attention again. David's existence creates complications." Elena felt the walls of her carefully constructed world closing in around her. The federal government that had given her a new life was now prepared to take it away, just as Vincent's legal maneuvering was about to expose everything she had worked to hide. She was caught between two forces that had shaped her existence, neither of which truly cared about the collateral damage their conflict might cause. "What kind of complications?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "If you testify, Vincent's lawyers will use your marriage against you. They'll argue that you've been living a lie for 8 years, that your credibility as a witness is compromised by your willingness to deceive the people closest to you. They'll paint you as someone who can't be trusted to tell the truth about anything." Elena understood the strategy immediately. Vincent had always been brilliant at finding weaknesses and exploiting them ruthlessly. Her marriage to David, the thing that had brought her the greatest happiness in her adult life, would become a weapon in her brother's defense. The love that had saved her would be twisted into evidence of her fundamental dishonesty. "And if I don't testify?" Vincent's conviction gets overturned on appeal. He walks free, and eventually he finds you. You know how patient your brother can be when he wants revenge. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices settling on her shoulders. She could disappear again, abandon David and the life they had built together, become someone new in some distant city where Elena Martinez had never existed. She could testify against Vincent again, knowing that doing so would destroy her marriage and expose David to dangers he had never signed up for. Or she could refuse to cooperate and wait for her brother to track her down, putting David at risk simply by staying in his life. How long do I have to decide? The trial starts in 6 weeks. If you're going to disappear, it needs to happen soon. If you're going to testify, we need to start preparing your testimony immediately. Elena hung up the phone and looked at David, who had been listening to her half of the conversation with growing alarm. She could see him beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation, the reality that their quiet suburban life was about to be shattered, regardless of what she chose to do. 6 weeks, she said simply. David nodded slowly. To decide whether to disappear forever or testify against your brother. Yes. And either choice means our marriage is over? Elena wanted to deny it, to insist that they could find a way through this together, but she had spent too many years learning to recognize harsh realities to indulge in false optimism now. David's entire life was here, in this town where he had built his business and his reputation. He had friends, clients, responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned for a new identity in witness protection. And if she stayed to testify, the resulting media attention and security concerns would make normal life impossible. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate for the magnitude of betrayal she was admitting. I'm so sorry for all of this, for lying to you, for putting you in this position. David was quiet for a long time, his attention focused on his hands folded on the breakfast table. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that broke Elena's heart more completely than anger would have. I fell in love with Elena Martinez. I married her, built a life with her, planned to grow old with her, but she never really existed, did she? She was just a character you created to hide from your real life. Elena wanted to protest, to insist that her feelings had always been genuine even if her identity had been fabricated. But she could see the truth in what David was saying. Elena Martinez had been designed by federal agents to be appealing, safe, the kind of woman who could disappear into suburban anonymity without raising questions. Every detail of her personality had been calculated to create maximum distance from Elena Torrino's criminal associations. The woman you fell in love with was me. Maybe the name was different. Maybe the history was manufactured.
The person you've been married to for 8 years is real. The way I feel about you is real. But the foundation was a lie, David replied. Every conversation we've had about the future, every plan we've made together was based on the assumption that you were free to make those choices. You never were. You've been living on borrowed time, with borrowed identity, in a borrowed life that was always going to end eventually. The accuracy of his assessment was devastating. Elena had convinced herself that witness protection was a new beginning, but David was right that it had always been temporary safety rather than permanent freedom. Vincent's appeal had been inevitable, just as Elena's eventual exposure had been guaranteed from the moment she chose to build a life with someone outside the federal program. "What happens now?" David asked. Elena looked around their kitchen, at the coffee cups that would never be finished, at the breakfast table where they had shared thousands of meals and conversations. She thought about David's birthday party, about the community center reservation she would have to cancel, about the band she would need to call with apologies. All the ordinary details of life that would need to be undone because Elena Torrino's past had finally caught up with Elena Martinez's present. "Now I have to decide who I want to be," she said. "And you have to decide if you can forgive me for not being who you thought I was." But even as she said it, Elena suspected that forgiveness wasn't really the issue. David might eventually understand why she had lied, might even accept that her deception had been motivated by love rather than malice. The real question was whether their marriage could survive the revelation that it had been built on foundations that were never meant to be permanent, whether love could bridge the gap between who Elena Martinez had pretended to be and who Elena Torrino actually was. Outside their window, the morning sun was climbing higher, illuminating the suburban street where they had made their home. Elena could see neighbors beginning their daily routines, walking dogs and collecting newspapers, living the kind of uncomplicated lives she had thought she could claim for herself. In a few hours, those same neighbors would see news vans parked on Maple Street, would learn that the quiet woman who had brought them cookies and helped organize block parties was actually the sister of one of the most notorious crime bosses in the country. The phone rang again, and Elena could see from David's expression that he understood their conversation was just beginning, that the next few weeks would bring revelations and decisions that would reshape everything they thought they knew about each other. The ordinary life they had built together was already over, destroyed not by anything they had done wrong, but by the simple fact that Elena's past had always been more powerful than her present. As she reached for the phone to answer what was undoubtedly another call from Agent Chen, Elena realized that the most painful part of this entire situation wasn't the prospect of losing her identity again, or even the danger she might face from Vincent's associates. It was watching the man she loved come to terms with the fact that their entire relationship had been built on a lie, that the woman he had planned to grow old with had never been free to make that promise in the first place. The trial that would determine Vincent Torrino's fate was still 6 weeks away. But Elena understood that her own judgment had already begun. Every choice she had made since entering witness protection, every day she had spent as Elena Martinez, every moment of happiness she had stolen from a life that was never truly hers, all of it would be weighed against the damage her deception had caused to the man who had loved her without reservation. And for the first time since she had testified against her brother 8 years ago, Elena wasn't certain she would survive what was coming next. The second phone call came from Elena's
graphic design client, Mrs. Henderson, who owned a small bakery downtown. Her voice trembled with excitement and confusion, as she explained that reporters had been calling her shop all morning asking about Elena Martinez and whether she had ever suspected her designer might be connected to organized crime. Mrs. Henderson assured Elena that she had told them nothing, but the fear in her voice was unmistakable. The quiet professional relationship they had maintained for 3 years was now tainted by association with criminal enterprise. Within an hour, Elena's phone had received 12 more calls. 3 were from other clients canceling upcoming projects, their apologetic voices barely masking their panic at being connected to someone with mob ties. 4 were from reporters who had somehow obtained her phone number, each offering increasingly large sums for an exclusive interview about life as Vincent Torrino's sister. 2 were from neighbors expressing concern, though Elena could detect the underlying curiosity that made their sympathy feel hollow. The final 3 calls were hang-ups, but Elena recognized the pattern from her father's house during her childhood when rivals would call just to confirm phone numbers were still active. David had moved to the living room, his laptop open, as he methodically searched through news articles about the Torrino family. Elena could hear the clicking of keys, the occasional sharp intake of breath when he discovered particularly disturbing details about her family's criminal activities. She wanted to go to him, to provide context for the sensationalized accounts he was reading, but she understood that he needed space to process the magnitude of deception that had shaped their entire relationship. From the kitchen doorway, Elena watched her husband discover her history through the eyes of prosecutors and journalists. She saw him reading about her father Anthony's rise to power in the 1980s, built on a foundation of labor union corruption and construction industry extortion. She watched his expression change as he learned about her Uncle Sal's involvement in arms trafficking, about Cousin Tony's conviction for 3 separate murders, about the family businesses that had served as fronts for money laundering operations spanning 2 decades. The worst moment came when David found the court transcripts from Vincent's original trial, publicly available documents that detailed Elena's testimony in devastating specificity. She had admitted to managing financial records for 17 different illegal enterprises, to personally witnessing at least 6 violent crimes, to helping orchestrate the murders of 2 rival family members by providing their schedules and security arrangements. The woman David had married, the one who worried about overwatering her tomatoes and cried during sad movies, had once been an integral part of a criminal organization responsible for dozens of deaths. Agent Chen's third call came with new urgency. Vincent's legal team had filed motions requesting Elena's current address and employment information, claiming they needed to serve subpoenas and conduct depositions. The federal prosecutors were fighting the requests, but constitutional protections for defendants meant Vincent's lawyers would likely gain access to at least some details about Elena's current life. The comfortable buffer of anonymity that had protected David was already beginning to dissolve. "They're going to find this house," Elena told David after ending the call. "Vincent's lawyers, reporters, maybe even some of his old associates. Staying here isn't safe for either of us." David looked up from his laptop, his face pale from whatever he had been reading. "Associates? You mean other criminals?" "Some of them, yes. Vincent maintained relationships with families in other cities, people who might see helping him as a way to gain favor or settle old debts. And there are legitimate business people who were involved in our operations, people who have a lot to lose if more details about money laundering come out." Seemed to disturb David more than the threats themselves. She could see him recognizing a different version of his wife, someone who evaluated dangers with professional detachment rather than civilian fear. This Elena spoke about criminal associates and violent retaliations as familiar concepts, part of a world where such considerations had once been routine parts of daily life. "How do you know so much about how this works?" David asked quietly. Elena realized that her explanation had revealed another layer of deception she hadn't intended to expose.
In trying to warn David about potential dangers, she had demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond what an unwilling witness might possess. She understood criminal psychology and organizational behavior because she had been raised inside that world, educated by masters of violence and intimidation who had seen her potential and cultivated her skills. "Because I wasn't just Vincent's sister," she admitted. "I wasn't just someone who happened to witness crimes or keep financial records. I was being groomed to take over parts of the family business. My father intended for me to eventually run the legitimate enterprises we used to launder money, to be the public face of operations that needed to appear respectable." David's expression shifted from shock to something approaching horror. "You were going to be the next generation?" "If I hadn't testified against Vincent, yes. My father died when I was 25 and Vincent took over leadership of the family, but he was always more comfortable with the violent aspects of our business. He needed someone who could handle complex financial arrangements, someone who could interface with legitimate business leaders without raising suspicions. Someone like me." Elena sat down across from David, close enough to see her reflection in his laptop screen, where an FBI organizational chart showed her photograph connected to various family members with red lines indicating criminal relationships. She looked younger in the official photo, her face harder and more calculating than the woman David had married. It was a reminder of how thoroughly she had transformed herself, both physically and emotionally, during her years in witness protection. "The testimony I gave wasn't just about things I witnessed," Elena continued. "I had intimate knowledge of how money moved through our operations, which legitimate businesses were compromised, which government officials had been corrupted. I could provide that information because I had been responsible for managing those relationships." David closed his laptop with a decisive snap, as if shutting out the visual evidence might make the conversation less real. "You weren't just a witness to your family's crimes. You were a participant." "Yes." "For how long?" Elena calculated quickly, measuring her involvement from the time she had started keeping books for her father's construction company to the night she had decided to contact the FBI. "About 7 years, from the time I graduated college until Vincent's arrest." 7 years of criminal activity, 7 years of being part of a murderous organization, and then 8 years of lying to me about all of it. The mathematics of deception laid out so starkly made Elena's choices seem even more inexcusable. She had spent more time as Elena Martinez than she had as an active member of the Torrino crime family, but somehow the earlier identity felt more authentic than the carefully constructed persona she had maintained during her marriage. Perhaps because Elena Torrino's choices had been her own, however destructive, while Elena Martinez had been designed by federal agents to be someone else's idea of normal. "David, I need you to understand something important," Elena said, recognizing that she was about to reveal information that would probably end their marriage, but might save David's life. "When I testified against Vincent, I didn't just provide evidence about past crimes. I gave prosecutors information about planned operations, including details that helped them prevent several murders, drug shipment that would have been worth millions of dollars to the family." David's eyes widened as he grasped the implications of her admission. "You didn't just betray your brother. You cost his organization money and saved the lives of his intended victims." Which means Vincent's desire for revenge isn't just personal, it's practical. "As long as I'm alive, I represent a threat to any attempts he might make to rebuild his operations after getting out of prison. I know too much about his methods, his contacts, his weaknesses." Elena watched David process this new layer of danger, saw him beginning to understand that her presence in his life had always carried risks he had never imagined. Every day of their marriage, Elena had been a potential target for assassination, kidnapping, or torture by people who viewed her continued existence as a threat to their freedom and financial security. David had been sleeping next to a woman with a price on her head, building a future with someone whose past might get them both killed. The doorbell rang, interrupting Elena's explanation. Through the front window, she could see a white van with satellite equipment and the logo of a national news network. A reporter was approaching their door, followed by a cameraman who was already filming their modest house and Elena's prize-winning garden. The media circus that Elena had dreaded for 8 years had arrived on Maple Street. "Don't answer it," Elena told David, but she could see neighbors beginning to emerge from their houses, drawn by the unusual activity. Mrs. Patterson from next door was openly staring, her morning newspaper forgotten as she watched reporters set up equipment on the sidewalk in front of Elena's home. The Johnsons' teenage son had his phone out, probably filming everything for social media distribution. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Agent Chen. Media attention escalating. Recommend immediate relocation to safe house. Can have team there in 30 minutes. The offer of federal protection represented a return to the life Elena had tried to leave behind, a world where her safety depended on government handlers and her identity could be changed at will. But it also meant abandoning David to face the aftermath of her exposure alone, leaving him to explain to neighbors and clients why his wife had disappeared in the middle of a federal criminal investigation. They want to take me to a safe house, Elena told David, showing him Agent Chen's message. Do it, David said immediately. If staying here puts you in danger, you should go. His quick agreement stung more than Elena had expected. She had hoped David might ask her to stay, might suggest they face the situation together despite the risks and complications. Instead, he seemed eager to have her removed from his life as quickly as possible, to begin the process of untangling their shared existence before the consequences of her deception could destroy his reputation and livelihood. What about us? Elena asked. What about our marriage? David was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused on the reporters gathering outside their window. Elena, I don't even know who you are. The woman I married was a fiction created by federal agents. The real you is someone who spent 7 years helping run a criminal organization and then lied about it for 8 years more. I don't know how to be married to that person. Elena felt the finality in his words like a physical blow. 8 years of marriage, of shared dreams and daily intimacies, were being reduced to a case of mistaken identity. The love that had felt so real and transformative was being dismissed as a relationship between David and a character Elena had been playing rather than her authentic self. I'm the same person you fell in love with, the woman who brings you coffee in bed every morning, who laughs at your terrible jokes, who cries when you watch war movies together. That's not an act, David. That's who I became because of how much I love you. But it's built on a foundation of lies, David replied. Every conversation we had
About the future assumes you're free to make choices about your life. You're not free, Elena. You never were. You're a federal witness whose safety depends on cooperation with law enforcement, whose identity can be changed whenever the government decides it's necessary. You can't promise me a future when you don't even own your present. The accuracy of David's assessment was devastating, because it highlighted truths Elena had refused to acknowledge during their marriage. She had made promises about growing old together while knowing that Vincent's eventual appeal would force her to choose between her safety and her happiness. She had planned their future while understanding that her past could resurface at any moment to destroy everything they had built together. Another news van pulled up to their curb, followed by a car that Elena didn't recognize but that carried the subtle signs of law enforcement. Tinted windows and government license plates that suggested federal agents were beginning to take an interest in the media attention surrounding Vincent Torrino's star witness. The quiet suburban street where Elena and David had built their life was transforming into the kind of circus atmosphere that Elena remembered from her childhood, when her father's legal troubles had drawn similar attention to their family compound. Elena's phone rang again, this time showing a number she hadn't seen in 8 years but that she recognized immediately. It was her cousin Maria, Vincent's daughter, calling from what was presumably a secure line given the complexity of the number display. Maria had been Elena's closest friend during childhood, the one person in the family who had understood Elena's reluctance to embrace the violent aspects of their business. Maria, Elena answered cautiously, aware that David was listening to every word. Lena, Maria used Elena's childhood nickname, spoken with an affection that made Elena's chest tighten with unexpected nostalgia. I saw the news about Papa's trial, about you testifying again. Elena had forgotten how much she missed the sound of her real name spoken by someone who had known her before witness protection, before federal agents had taught her to respond to Elena Martinez with the automatic reflex of someone who had never been called anything else. Maria's voice carried memories of Sunday dinners and childhood secrets, of the brief period when Elena had believed her family's business was nothing more dangerous than construction and waste management. Maria, I can't talk about the trial, you know that. I'm not calling about the trial, Maria said quickly. I'm calling because I'm worried about you, about what might happen when Papa gets out.
The person she had become during 8 years of marriage represented genuine transformation or just another form of hiding. 1 hour, Maria said.
Just coffee and conversation between cousins who love each other despite everything that's happened. The line went dead before Elena could respond, leaving her staring at her phone while David watched her with growing concern. She could see him trying to interpret her half of the conversation, probably wondering whether Elena's criminal family was attempting to draw her back into their orbit just when she was most vulnerable to federal pressure. "That was your cousin," David said. It wasn't a question. "Vincent's daughter, yes. She wants to meet. Are you going to do it?" Elena considered the question carefully. Meeting Maria would mean venturing out of the relative safety of federal protection to engage with someone who remained connected to the criminal world Elena had tried to leave behind. But it might also provide information about Vincent's intentions, about whether Elena's family viewed her testimony as a betrayal that demanded retribution, or simply as a survival strategy they could understand, if not forgive. "I think I have to," Elena said finally. "Maria might know things about Vincent's plans that could help me make better decisions about what comes next. Or she might be setting you up for revenge on behalf of her father." Elena shook her head. "Maria was never part of the violent side of our business. She was always more like me, someone who understood what the family did but tried to stay away from the worst of it. If she wanted to hurt me, she would have found easier ways than meeting in public." David stood up and walked to the window, where the number of media vehicles had doubled in the past 20 minutes. "Elena, I think you need to call Agent Chen and accept that safe house placement. This is getting out of control, and I don't think you're thinking clearly about the dangers." Elena followed David to the window and saw what had captured his attention. Across the street, partially hidden behind Mrs. Patterson's hedge, stood a man in an expensive suit who was photographing their house with professional equipment. He wasn't dressed like a reporter, and his camera setup suggested surveillance rather than journalism. Elena's training from her criminal family kicked in automatically, cataloging details about the man's positioning, his equipment, his possible escape routes. "That's not a reporter," Elena said quietly. "How do you know?" "Body language, equipment, positioning. Reporters want to be visible so they can approach you for interviews. This person is trying to remain hidden while gathering information about our home, our routines, our security arrangements." Elena watched David absorb this distinction, saw him beginning to understand that her past had given her skills in threat assessment that extended far beyond anything Elena Martinez should have possessed. The quiet suburban wife who had never mentioned feeling unsafe was revealing expertise in counter-surveillance that suggested familiarity with being watched by dangerous people. "Should we call the police?" David asked. "And tell them what? That someone is taking pictures from a public street? They're not breaking any laws, and local police aren't equipped to handle the kind of people who might be interested in our address." Elena's phone buzzed with another text from Agent Chen. "Surveillance teams spotted at your location. Federal protection strongly recommended. Vehicle standing by 3 blocks away." The federal agents monitoring Elena's situation had identified the same threat that Elena had noticed, confirming that her instincts about the photographer were accurate. She was being watched by people whose interest went beyond mere curiosity about Vincent Torrino's sister. Someone wanted detailed information about her current life, her home, her routines, her vulnerabilities. "David, you need to leave," Elena said suddenly. "Pack a bag and boasty with your sister in Boston until the situation resolves itself. I'm not abandoning you."
Not abandoning me. You're protecting yourself from dangers you never signed up for when you married Elena Martinez. These people, whoever they are, they're not interested in you. But if you stay in this house, you become a potential target simply by association. Elena could see David struggling with conflicting impulses, torn between his desire to distance himself from her deception and his reluctance to leave her alone when she was clearly in danger. 8 years of marriage had created bonds that couldn't be severed immediately, even when trust had been destroyed by revelation of fundamental dishonesty. "What about you?" David asked. "I'm going to meet Maria, and then I'm going to decide whether to cooperate with the federal prosecutors or disappear into witness protection again. Either way, this version of my life is over."
Elena looked around their living room, at the photographs documenting 8 years of marriage, at the furniture they had chosen together, at the ordinary accumulation of shared life that would soon be abandoned or distributed among strangers. In a few hours, Elena Martinez would cease to exist, replaced either by a federal witness in protective custody or by whatever new identity Agent Chen's team created for her next phase of hiding. "I'm sorry," Elena said, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "I'm sorry for lying to you, for building our life on a foundation of deception, for bringing dangers into your world that you never deserved to face." David was quiet for a moment, his attention focused on the surveillance team across the street. "I believe you're sorry," he said finally, "but I don't think you understand what you're apologizing for. It's not just the lying, Elena. It's the fact that you made choices about my life without telling me. You decided that I was safer not knowing the truth, but you never gave me the chance to make that decision for myself." Elena felt the justice of his accusation. She had convinced herself that protecting David from knowledge of her past was an act of love, but she could see now that it had been a form of control. She had decided unilaterally that David couldn't handle the truth about her identity, that their marriage was more important than his right to know who he was actually married to. "You're right," Elena admitted. "I should have told you everything from the beginning. I should have let you decide whether you wanted to be married to Elena Torrino instead of making that choice for you. But you couldn't have done that, because if you had told me the truth, Elena Martinez never would have existed. Your entire identity was designed to attract someone exactly like me, someone whose life was simple enough to provide cover for a federal witness, but complicated enough to make your presence seem natural." Elena felt a chill as she realized David had identified something she hadn't fully acknowledged even to herself. Elena Martinez hadn't been a random identity created by federal marshals. She had been specifically designed to appeal to David Lawson, or someone very much like him. The agents had studied David's background, his preferences, his vulnerabilities, and had created a woman who would naturally attract his interest and trust. "They profiled you," Elena said slowly. "The federal marshals researched your background and created Elena Martinez to be exactly the kind of woman you would fall in love with." David nodded grimly. "Small-town real estate agent, recently divorced, no family nearby, established social connections but not too many close friends. I was the perfect target for someone who needed to establish a new identity quickly and convincingly."
Manipulation, rather than authentic chemistry. Elena's phone rang again, interrupting her contemplation of how thoroughly she and David had been used by people who viewed their happiness as a convenient side effect of witness protection logistics. This time, the caller was Agent Chen, probably responding to reports from the surveillance team about the photographer across the street. "Elena, we need to move you now," Agent Chen said without preamble. "We've identified at least 2 surveillance teams watching your house, and we have reason to believe Vincent's people are planning some kind of intervention before you can testify." "What kind of intervention?" "The kind that would make your testimony unnecessary. Elena, these people aren't interested in intimidation or negotiation. They want you permanently silent, and they're willing to accept collateral damage to achieve that goal." Elena looked at David, who was still processing the revelation that his marriage might have been arranged by federal agents as part of Elena's cover identity. She understood that Agent Chen was telling her David's life was in immediate danger simply because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Elena Martinez needed a husband to make her suburban disguise convincing. "How long do we have?" Elena asked. "Minutes, not hours. There's a federal vehicle parked 2 streets away. Pack only essential items and leave immediately through your back door. We'll handle the media and conduct a sweep of your house after you're secure." Elena ended the call and looked at David, seeing her own fear reflected in his expression. 8 years of marriage were about to end not with divorce papers or relationship counseling, but with Elena disappearing into federal protection while David remained behind to explain her absence to neighbors, clients, and reporters who would never understand the complicated truths that had destroyed their suburban paradise. "They want me to leave now," Elena told David, "through the back door, with federal agents who are waiting 2 streets away." "Then go."
Elena had expected David to argue, to insist on coming with her, or at least to demand more time to process what was happening. His immediate agreement to her departure felt like abandonment, even though she understood logically that staying would endanger both their lives. "That's it?" Elena asked. "8 years of marriage, and you're ready for me to disappear forever?" David's expression softened slightly, and Elena could see the man she had fallen in love with beneath the shock and betrayal of the past few hours. "Elena, I love you. Or, I love the woman I thought you were. But I can't be married to someone whose existence depends on federal protection, whose past might get us both killed, whose future is determined by prosecutors and defense attorneys rather than the choices we make together." Elena understood that David was right, but the finality of his decision still hurt more than she had anticipated. She had spent 8 years believing that their love could overcome any obstacle, that the strength of their connection would be enough to survive whatever challenges they might face. But she had never imagined challenges that involved assassination attempts by organized crime families, or the revelation that their entire relationship might have been orchestrated by federal agents. "I need to get some things," Elena said, moving toward their bedroom. As she packed the few items Agent Chan had said were essential, Elena found herself taking inventory of Elena Martinez's life. The jewelry David had given her for birthdays and anniversaries, the clothing that reflected Elena Martinez's practical but feminine style, the photographs that documented 8 years of carefully constructed normalcy. Most of it would have to be left behind, abandoned along with the identity that had given Elena her only experience of genuine happiness. In her jewelry box, hidden beneath the velvet lining, Elena found the emergency cash Agent Chan had insisted she maintain throughout her years in witness protection.
$2,000 in cash, a driver's license with yet another name, and a phone number that would connect her to federal resources if Elena Martinez was ever compromised. She had hoped never to use these items, but their presence had always served as a reminder that Elena Martinez's life was temporary, subject to termination whenever Vincent Torrino's legal situation required her testimony. David appeared in the doorway while Elena finished packing, his own overnight bag in hand. "I've decided to go to Boston tonight," he said. "I don't think either of us should be in this house when Vincent's people arrive." Elena felt a surge of relief that David was taking his own safety seriously, even if it meant they were both abandoning the life they had built together. "That's smart. Stay away until Agent Chen confirms it's safe to return." "Elena, before you go, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Elena nodded, understanding that David deserved absolute truth after 8 years of carefully managed deception. "During our marriage, were there ever moments when you forgot you were Elena Martinez? When you were just yourself, whoever that is, without thinking about maintaining your cover identity?" The question was more complex than David probably realized, touching on fundamental issues of identity and authenticity that Elena had been grappling with throughout her years in witness protection. She thought about lazy Sunday mornings when she had felt completely at peace, about conversations with David that had seemed to reveal aspects of her personality she hadn't known existed, about moments of happiness so genuine that she had forgotten to monitor her responses for consistency with Elena Martinez's carefully constructed background. "Yes," Elena said finally, "more often than I expected when this all began. There were times when I felt like Elena Martinez was becoming more real than Elena Torrino had ever been. But Elena Martinez was designed by federal agents to be appealing to someone like me. How do you know those moments were authentic rather than just successful psychological programming?" Elena considered the question carefully, recognizing that David was asking her to distinguish between genuine emotion and the results of behavioral conditioning. It was possible that 8 years of living as Elena Martinez had simply made the performance so complete that Elena herself could no longer identify where the character ended and her authentic self began. "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Maybe the distinction doesn't matter anymore. Maybe we become who we pretend to be, especially when we pretend for long enough and with enough commitment." David's expression suggested that her answer had confirmed his worst fears about the authenticity of their relationship. Elena understood that he needed to believe their love had been based on something more substantial than federal witness protection protocols,
but she couldn't provide certainties she didn't possess about her own motivations and feelings. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message, consisting of a single word. Now. "I have to go," Elena told David, shouldering her bag. They stood in their bedroom for a moment, surrounded by the accumulated evidence of 8 years of marriage. Elena wanted to say something meaningful, to provide David with some kind of closure or promise about the future. But she understood that Elena Martinez's story was ending, and Elena Torrino's continuation was entirely uncertain. "I love you," Elena said simply. "Whatever happens next, whatever you decide about me and about us, I want you to know that loving you has been the best part of my life." David nodded, his own emotions clearly held in check by the surreal circumstances of their goodbye. "I love you too. I just don't know who I love anymore." Elena left through the back door without looking back, understanding that doing so would make leaving impossible. She could hear David's car starting in the driveway as she made her way through their neighbor's yard toward the street where Agent Chen's
team was waiting. In a few minutes, Elena Martinez would disappear forever, leaving David to explain her absence to a community that had known her only as the quiet woman who brought excellent cookies to every potluck dinner. As Elena approached the unmarked federal vehicle, she realized that she was about to embark on the most dangerous phase of her relationship with Vincent Torrino. For 8 years, her brother had believed she was safely hidden somewhere beyond his reach. Now he knew exactly where she had been living, who she had been living with, and how much she had to lose if he decided that revenge was more important than avoiding additional federal charges. Elena got into the passenger seat of Agent Chen's car and watched her house disappear in the rearview mirror, taking with it the only period of her adult life when she had felt truly safe and genuinely loved. Tomorrow she would begin preparing to testify against Vincent again, but tonight she was simply a woman leaving behind everything she had ever wanted in order to protect the man she loved from consequences he had never deserved to face. The irony wasn't lost on Elena that in order to keep David safe, she was once again becoming the person she had spent 8 years trying not to be. Elena Torrino was emerging from Elena Martinez's carefully maintained grave, bringing with her all the skills, knowledge, and ruthless pragmatism that had once made her valuable to one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. As Agent Chen's car pulled away from Maple Street, Elena understood that her transformation back into Elena Torrino was already beginning. The woman who had worried about watering schedules and birthday party planning was being replaced by someone who could evaluate surveillance teams and assess assassination risks with professional competence. Elena Martinez had been a beautiful dream, but Elena Torrino was who she would need to be if she wanted to survive what was coming next. The federal safe house occupied a nondescript ranch home in a suburban development 40 miles from Elena's former life. Its beige exterior and generic landscaping designed to blend seamlessly into middle-class anonymity. Agent Chen had explained during the drive that the location housed witnesses awaiting trial testimony, people whose lives had been temporarily suspended while federal prosecutors prepared their cases against organized crime figures, corrupt politicians, and corporate executives who had made the mistake of assuming their crimes would remain hidden forever. Elena's assigned room contained standard government-issue furniture and a window that overlooked a playground where children played under the watchful eyes of parents who had no idea their neighborhood had become a temporary sanctuary for people running from their past. The normalcy of the scene felt surreal after the morning's revelations, a reminder that ordinary life continued even while Elena's carefully constructed world collapsed around her. Agent Chen had left Elena alone to process the transition, promising to return within hours to begin preparation for her testimony against Vincent. The federal prosecutors needed Elena to review thousands of pages of evidence, to refresh her memory about financial transactions and criminal meetings that had taken place nearly a decade ago, to prepare for cross-examination by defense attorneys who would attack every aspect of her credibility and character. Elena's phone, which Agent Chen had allowed her to keep for now, contained 17 text messages from David. The first few expressed concern for her safety and asked her to confirm she had reached the safe house without incident. The middle messages were longer, more emotional, as David processed his anger and heard about the fundamental deception that had shaped their marriage. The final messages were shorter, more resigned, acknowledging that their relationship could not survive the revelation that Elena Martinez had never been more than an elaborate federal witness protection cover story.
The message from David simply read, "I've retained a lawyer to handle the divorce proceedings. I'll make sure you receive the papers wherever Agent Chen thinks it's safe to send them. I'm sorry our story had to end this way." Elena stared at the message for a long time, understanding that David's decision to begin divorce proceedings represented the final death of Elena Martinez. The woman who had planned birthday parties and tended vegetable gardens had been declared legally dead by the man who had loved her. Replaced by Elena Torrino, federal witness and former criminal collaborator whose future would be determined by prosecutors and defense attorneys rather than personal choice. A knock at the door interrupted Elena's contemplation of her dissolved marriage. Agent Chen entered carrying a stack of files and a laptop computer, the tools necessary to reconstruct Elena's knowledge of Vincent's criminal operations and prepare her for what would likely be the most important testimony of her life. "I know this is difficult," Agent Chen began, settling into the chair across from Elena's bed. "Transitioning back to your role as a federal witness after 8 years of civilian life is never easy, especially when it means leaving behind relationships and commitments you've need." Elena appreciated Agent Chen's acknowledgement of her loss, but she detected the subtle implication that personal relationships were always secondary to witness protection obligations. Federal agents viewed emotional attachments as potential security vulnerabilities, complications that could compromise their ability to keep witnesses alive long enough to testify against dangerous criminals. "Tell me about Vincent's current situation," Elena said, recognizing that dwelling on David's divorce decision would only make the coming weeks more difficult to endure. Agent Chen opened one of the files, revealing photographs of Vincent taken during recent court appearances. 8 years in federal prison had aged Elena's brother considerably, his once commanding presence diminished by institutional life and the stress of fighting multiple appeals simultaneously. But his eyes retained the calculating intelligence that had made him such an effective criminal leader, the ability to identify weaknesses and exploit them ruthlessly. "Vincent's legal team has developed a sophisticated strategy for his appeal," Agent Chen explained. "They're arguing that his original conviction was based on testimony from unreliable witnesses who had been coerced by federal prosecutors into providing false information in exchange for reduced sentences and witness protection benefits." Elena understood immediately how her marriage to David would be used to support Vincent's defense strategy. Her 8 years of deception, her willingness to lie to the person closest to her about fundamental aspects of her identity would be presented as evidence that she was inherently dishonest and therefore untrustworthy as a witness. "They know about David," Elena said. "It wasn't a question. Vincent's lawyers have been investigating your current life since the appeal was announced 6 months ago. They have photographs of your house, documentation of your marriage, records of David's business activities, and testimony from neighbors about your behavior and personality as Elena Martinez." Agent Chen produced a thick folder containing what appeared to be a comprehensive surveillance report on Elena's life and witness protection. The federal government that had created Elena Martinez's identity had apparently allowed Vincent's defense team to document her existence in extraordinary detail, providing ammunition that could be used to discredit her testimony and secure Vincent's release from prison. "Why wasn't I informed that Vincent's people were investigating my life?" Elena asked. "Because we needed to determine the scope of their knowledge and the methods they were using to gather information. If we had warned you earlier, you might have changed your behavior patterns in ways that would have alerted us to our surveillance of their surveillance." Elena felt a familiar chill as she recognized the casual manipulation that characterized her relationship with federal law enforcement. Agent Chen had allowed Elena to live in ignorance of the threats surrounding her, had permitted her to maintain the illusion of safety even while Vincent's associates documented her daily routines and identified vulnerabilities that could be exploited for intimidation or worse. "What about David's safety?" Elena asked. "If Vincent's people know about him, if they've been watching our house and documenting our relationship, then David is a potential target for retaliation." Agent Chen's expression became carefully neutral, the practiced face of someone delivering bad news to people who had no choice but to accept it. "David's safety is not our primary concern. He was never officially part of the witness protection program, and his relationship with you was not authorized by federal authorities. We cannot extend protection to civilians who become involved with protected witnesses without proper clearance and security protocols."
Elena felt the injustice of Agent Chen's position like a physical blow. David's life was potentially in danger because Elena had fallen in love with him, because federal agents had created an identity specifically designed to attract someone like him, because Elena had chosen happiness over security protocols that no one had adequately explained when she entered witness protection. "You profiled David," Elena said, remembering her conversation with him that morning. "Federal agents researched his background and created Elena Martinez to be exactly the kind of woman he would find attractive and trustworthy." Agent Chen's silence confirmed Elena's accusation. The federal government had identified David as a suitable cover for Elena's new identity, had engineered their meeting and manipulated their relationship to serve witness protection objectives, and was now prepared to abandon David to whatever consequences Vincent's people might devise. David was selected because his profile suggested he would be unlikely to ask difficult questions about your background, Agent Chen admitted. Recent divorce, established local roots, profession that would provide social cover for your presence in the community, psychological profile suggesting someone who valued stability over excitement. He was an ideal candidate for providing long-term cover for a federal witness. Elena understood that she and David had both been used by federal agents who viewed their happiness as a convenient byproduct of witness protection logistics. Their love had been genuine, but it had developed within a framework of manipulation designed to serve government interests, rather than personal fulfillment. And now you're prepared to sacrifice him to Vincent's revenge because protecting him would be inconvenient for federal prosecutors? Elena, we're prepared to do whatever is necessary to ensure your testimony against Vincent Torrino. Your brother is responsible for dozens of murders and millions of dollars in criminal activity. His conviction serves the greater good, even if individual people suffer collateral damage during the process. Elena recognized the familiar calculus of government agents who measured human costs against perceived benefits, who made decisions about life and death based on abstract principles of justice rather than consideration for the actual people affected by their choices. It was the same logic that had convinced Elena to testify against Vincent originally, the belief that stopping criminal organizations justified destroying families and abandoning loyalties that had once seemed sacred. "I want protection for David," Elena said firmly. "Either you arrange security for him until Vincent's trial concludes, or you find another witness to testify against my brother."
Valuable, but not essential. The threat was clear. Elena could either accept David's abandonment or face Vincent's assassins without federal protection. Agent Chen was reminding Elena that witness protection was a privilege that could be revoked if she became too difficult to manage, leaving her exposed to the same dangers that had originally forced her to cooperate with federal prosecutors. But Elena had spent 8 years learning to think like Elena Martinez, and Elena Martinez had never been intimidated by bureaucrats who mistook their authority for actual power. More importantly, Elena Torrino had always understood that the most dangerous opponents were those who underestimated her willingness to accept risks in pursuit of objectives they considered irrational. "Then I guess you don't need my testimony," Elena said calmly. "I'll take my chances with Vincent's people rather than cooperate with federal agents who are prepared to let innocent people die for bureaucratic convenience." Agent Chen's carefully controlled expression showed the first signs of concern. "Elena, you're not thinking clearly about your situation. Without federal protection, Vincent's associates will find you within days. Your brother has spent 8 years planning his revenge, and he has resources that extend far beyond what you experienced before entering witness protection." Elena stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the playground where children continued their games under parents' watchful supervision. The scene reminded her of everything she had hoped to build with David, the ordinary family life that had been destroyed by revelations she should have shared years earlier. "Agent Chen, I've spent 8 years learning to value things that Elena Torrino never cared about. Love, loyalty, the kind of trust that develops between people who choose to build a life together despite their individual flaws and limitations. Elena Martinez taught me that those things matter more than personal safety or federal prosecutions or even justice for victims of organized crime." Elena turned back to face Agent Chen, seeing her own determination reflected in the agent's growing alarm. "If protecting David means I have to choose between federal cooperation and personal safety, then I choose David. If that means Vincent kills me before I can testify, then at least I'll die protecting someone I love rather than cooperating with people who view human relationships as convenient tools for achieving bureaucratic objectives."
Agent Chen stood up quickly, her professional demeanor replaced by genuine concern about losing a crucial witness to what she clearly considered a misguided romantic loyalty. Elena, think about what you're saying. You're willing to let Vincent escape justice? To allow him to rebuild his criminal organization? To permit him to kill other people? All because you want to protect one man who may not even want your protection? Elena felt the justice of Agent Chen's argument, but she also understood that her decision represented more than romantic sentiment. 8 years of marriage to David had taught her that some loyalties transcended rational cost-benefit analysis, that love created obligations that couldn't be measured against abstract concepts of justice or public safety. David didn't choose to become involved in this situation, Elena replied. He was targeted by federal agents and manipulated into a relationship that put his life at risk without his knowledge or consent. He deserves protection from the consequences of decisions he never made. Agent Chen walked to the door, her hand on the handle as she prepared to leave Elena alone to reconsider her position. I'm going to give you 24 hours to think about your decision. After that, if you refuse to cooperate with Vincent's prosecution, we'll withdraw federal protection and you'll be on your own. Elena understood that Agent Chen's ultimatum represented her final opportunity to choose safety over loyalty, federal cooperation over personal obligation. But she also understood that Elena Martinez's 8 years of happiness had been built on David's unknowing sacrifice.
His willingness to love someone whose identity had been manufactured by government agents for purposes he had never been told about. I don't need 24 hours, Elena said. I've made my decision. Either David receives federal protection until Vincent's trial concludes, or I withdraw my cooperation and take my chances with my brother's revenge. Agent Chen left without responding, but Elena could see from her expression that the agent understood Elena's position was final. Federal prosecutors would now have to decide whether Elena's testimony was valuable enough to justify extending protection to David, or whether they preferred to proceed with Vincent's prosecution using other evidence and witnesses. Elena's phone rang an hour later, displaying a number she didn't recognize, but which carried the distinctive patterns of federal law enforcement communications. She answered cautiously, unsure whether Agent Chen had escalated Elena's demands to higher authority or whether Vincent's associates had somehow obtained access to secure government phone systems. Miss Torrino, this is Assistant United States Attorney James Morrison. I understand you've made some demands regarding protection for your husband as a condition of your continued cooperation with our prosecution of Vincent Torrino. Elena recognized Morrison's name from newspaper articles about high-profile organized crime prosecutions. He was known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to use whatever leverage was necessary to secure convictions against major criminal figures. His direct involvement in Elena's situation suggested that federal prosecutors considered her testimony crucial to Vincent's continued imprisonment. I've requested protection for David because he was placed in danger by federal agents who manipulated him into a relationship designed to provide cover for my witness protection placement, Elena replied. He deserves security from threats he never chose to face. Morrison was quiet for a moment, presumably weighing the costs of extending federal protection against the value of Elena's testimony. Miss Torrino, David Lawson has already left Connecticut and is currently staying with relatives in Boston. Our assessment is that he faces minimal risk as long as he remains away from your former residence and avoids contact with you during the trial period. Elena felt simultaneous relief that David was safe and betrayal that federal agents had been monitoring his movements without informing her. You've been tracking David's location? We've been ensuring his safety while maintaining operational security for your protection program. Mr. Lawson's cooperation with his own security has been exemplary, which suggests he understands the seriousness of the situation even if he hasn't been fully briefed on the specific threats. Elena understood that Morrison was telling her David was already receiving informal federal protection, that agents were monitoring his safety even if he hadn't been officially informed about the surveillance. It was a compromise that provided David with security while allowing federal prosecutors to maintain that they weren't extending witness protection benefits to unauthorized civilians. What assurances can you provide about David's long-term safety? Elena asked. If you testify against Vincent as scheduled, we anticipate his conviction will be upheld and his sentence will be extended due to additional charges related to witness intimidation attempts. Once Vincent is serving an extended federal sentence, the threat level against both you and Mr. Lawson
decreases significantly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.